We here on the News with Rick Sanchez began reporting on the Jeffrey Epstein story way before it was cool to do so. We even went out on the limb and said this right here on this show. Let me ask you a very simple question. Do you think he will survive prison?
Yeah. I mean, there's no reason why. If the fact
you don't think he'll disappear, given all he knows about some of the most powerful people in the world?
No. I think, no. Because it's too obvious.
All right.
It's too obvious.
But that's not all. Then I went on, or was invited by former Governor Jesse Ventura to go on his show, and I shared with him, out of the blue, this journalistic hunch I had. Now, let's move off from journalistic questioning and the type of stuff you and I normally do and just talk about what the word is on the street.
All right.
All right. The word on the street is Epstein is not going to survive prison. And that interview was conducted July 24th. That's a full 2.5 weeks before Jeffrey Epstein was found dead in his cell. Since then, there have been a bevy of stories, most of which are based on little more than conjecture. So we, for the most part, have kind of shied away from them. But there's one link, one story to Epstein that keeps resurfacing. I want you to listen carefully now to this fascinating story of a guy named Robert Maxwell. And joining us now is George Galloway from across the pond, former MP, all-around truth teller. It's always a pleasure to be able to have George on our newscast to explain things to us that oftentimes are, at least by most people, unexplainable. So suddenly this character, Robert Maxwell, deceased, we should add for our viewers, becomes fascinating. And a lot of people are trying to figure out who this fella is. George, I think there's no one better than you to explain that to us. Who's Robert Maxwell?
Well, he's risen from the deep because his favorite child, his daughter, Ghislaine, he did have other daughters, but he had a particular fixation, I would call it, with her because she was the child most like him. So who was he? He was, in the 1980s, an incredibly powerful media baron. He owned 6 national newspapers. He was a rival to Rupert Murdoch, nowadays much better known, and he was the greatest thief of the 20th century. He stole £500 million in 1980s prices from his own employees' pension funds, and he did many other things too. And I come into his life because I was, first of all, throughout the 1980s, a big critic of his business operation, which I knew was up to no good. And then one night, on a Saturday at the very beginning of the 1990s, Seymour Hersh, the legendary American journalist, caused to be delivered to my home a file of papers, which, to say the least, were very interesting. They were papers from a book that Hersh had written, but which Maxwell, unknown to any of us, had secretly, legally suppressed. He took a pre-publication injunction against anyone printing it, publishing it, distributing it, or selling it, or even writing about it, except I was a member of Parliament with the ancient right to speak freely in Parliament without fear of being sued or injuncted in any way. And once I'd read those papers, I was determined to do that. So, inter alia, I accused him in Parliament, Robert Maxwell, of being an arms dealer, an agent of the Israeli Secret Service, the Mossad, and most importantly, of having betrayed the whereabouts of the brave Israeli whistleblower Mordechai Vanunu in London, causing his kidnapping, drugging, and carting off to Israel, and 20 years nearly of solitary confinement. Maxwell then hit back with all of his media power. He told his editors to micturate all over Galloway, and they promptly did, even though Maxwell turned out to have stolen their pensions. I sued, and by the next month, I think, 4 weeks later, Maxwell was dead, having either fallen or been pushed or even had been murdered on board his yacht, which was called the Lady Ghislaine. Ghislaine Maxwell. His yacht was called after her. He was then buried with full Israeli state honors on the Mount of Olives, buried by the President and the Prime Minister of Israel, and no less than 7 serving or former heads of the Mossad. So it's quite clear that Robert Maxwell did perform what the President of Israel called at the funeral extraordinary service for Israel. Of course, exactly what that service was buried with him on the Mount of Olives. Question now, Rick, is, was Ghislaine Maxwell very like her father indeed? Was she performing an extraordinary service? And if so, by whom in her really tangled relationship with the late Jeffrey Epstein?
Well, as the stories are being written here stateside, it has to do with a young lady or woman, depends on how you want to describe her, who suddenly found herself without her father, without her father's finances, and she just needed a new sugar daddy, so to speak. And that sugar daddy turned out to be Jeffrey Epstein. But is there more to that story, right? I mean, that's the $60,000 question here, George.
Yeah, as we used to say when $64,000 was a lot of dollars. The big question, you're right. The issue of how much sugar this particular daddy actually had and where he got it from is, I think, the key. As Deep Throat once said, follow the money. It's my take that actually Jeffrey Epstein was not a billionaire, and he may have been acting as a front for other people. And Ghislaine Maxwell may well have been, if you like, his handler in that operation. This is still a work in progress, you're right. We can't say these things definitively now. But if she would only produce herself, or the US government would produce her, well, we might be able to ask her these questions. But she's disappeared off the face of the earth, and we must hope that she doesn't meet the same watery fate that her late father did.
We thank you, George Galloway, as this story, as the late, great Yogi Berra would say, gets curiouser and curiouser. Thank you, George. We appreciate it as usual.
Thank you very much.
Tomorrow, on part 2 of my interview with George Galloway, we ask, where is this woman? Where is Maxwell's daughter? Epstein's so-called fixer? Why aren't the police interviewing her? Why isn't she in custody? Fascinating part of the story, especially with what Mr. Galloway will share. All right. So you haven't heard that we're the ones covering the stories that you won't see covered anywhere else? In Venezuela, Kazakhstan. Let's go to Hong Kong. And the media reaction to that has been crickets. How about the way we cover those stories? What the hell does that mean? Wowee, wowee, wowee. That's the key word in this case, uprising. Keep? Can you believe that? Watching. This is the right thing for members of the media to do, to actually pick sides. Look, if you like what you see, subscribe.